There are 5 million victims of elder abuse in this country every year, but most of you are not aware of this growing problem. Learn more on Connecting Our Community, coming up next. Hello everybody, I'm Karen Allen and welcome to Connecting Our Community. Today, a special guest, Bill Benson, the National Policy Advisor of the National Adult Protective Services Association. Long title. And there's more, because he has a whole host of credits and accomplishments to his name. He was the keynote speaker at the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day in June, and he's a founding member of the Elder Justice Coalition. Now, Bill, thanks for joining us.
Thank you,
When
Karen.
we talk about elder and vulnerable adult abuse, who are the people you consider elder, and who do you consider vulnerable?
Great question. Generally across the country, elder is 60 years of age and older. Most jurisdictions, meaning states, will determine that a person is considered an elder abuse victim at age 60 and over. Some places might choose 65, but generally 60. And then there's a category of older vulnerable adults between 18 and 59 generally, that although they're not considered elder abuse, they're adult abuse. Vulnerable are those that are unable to care for themselves, who have impaired decision-making capacity, have difficulty making decisions because of impairments, including things like dementia, for example. People who, because they are so frail or have difficulty managing their own affairs, make them vulnerable. Vulnerability really comes in many forms.
That could be a broad spectrum from mental illness of many kinds, or whatever other reason they could be on disability.
Absolutely.
So that really is a broad spectrum.
It's a very broad spectrum, yeah.
Okay. What are the main types of abuse that you see?
Well, there's physical abuse, of course, hitting somebody, slapping them, doing various things like that. That's probably what most people think of in terms of elder abuse. They think of physical abuse. Sexual abuse, of course. It's much more common than I think most people would care to think, but it is more common than you would imagine.
Right.
Psychological abuse, harassment, verbally abusing people, being just incredibly mean and nasty and threatening. There's financial abuse, which of course is something that affects people regardless of their income status. And then finally there's a category called self-abuse or self-neglect. And these are people who become a danger to themselves or others because of their frailties or their limitations or their mental capacity.
Whatever disability
Right.
could get worse and people might not notice. Psychological abuse is something that is really easy to slip under and be undetected. Emotional abuse.
Oh, absolutely.
Is that,
yeah, emotional abuse is very tough to detect.
when you say that people are being mean, just like nanny cam, actually.
Right.
Where people didn't believe anything until they actually saw
Right.
things on camera. I think that is really tough to detect. Am I right about that?
I think every form of abuse is tough to detect, but certainly
Unless you see bruises.
Unless you see, and even then,
often, yeah.
you're not going to see them unless you have reason to be a physician, perhaps,
Right. Oh
or
my goodness.
something like that. But you're right, psychological abuse is very tough to detect.
All of this is heartbreaking. It's because these are populations that are disabled or in some way unable to stand up for themselves,
Right.
and that just is hard to take. But because they're grown and older, people in this society don't pay as much attention to them as they should, and that's heartbreaking. And these are our parents, aunts, uncles, grandfathers, grandmothers. What would you say are the main types of abuse of all those that you mentioned?
Well, the most common is self-neglect. That's the most common.
Is it?
Then probably psychological and emotional abuse comes in next. Financial abuse is extraordinarily commonplace. We know that millions of people are abused financially in one form or another. And very often financial abuse isn't in a vacuum. It's often accompanied by other forms of abuse. So if you have a perpetrator, a caretaker, whether they are a paid caretaker who's abusive or a family member, and I want to talk about that in just a moment, usually they don't limit themselves to, I'm just going to take grandmother's money or this older person's money. I'm probably also going to abuse them in some other way. So they very much often go hand in glove.
Once they cross a line,
Right.
they obviously have no conscience and they just continue.
Right.
How does this compare to child abuse, domestic violence, or other kinds of abuses? You know, these kinds of elder abuse.
Well, that's another great question, because we are so aware of child abuse, as we need to be,
Yeah.
as well as various forms of domestic violence. But the 5 million cases of elder abuse that we have in this country each year,
5 million.
5 million. That's
Yeah.
1 out of every 10 older people.
Like we said at the beginning, that's
Exactly.
1 out of how many?
1 out of every 10 older persons. That's 10% of the population annually. The numbers of cases dwarf the numbers of child abuse and domestic violence abuse in this country. The two combined together are less than the total number of elder abuse. Now, a lot of that, of course, is demographics. And we just have a huge number of older people, and we will have a lot more. But they also are, like children, especially vulnerable in far too many circumstances. But the numbers are staggering. They are staggering.
That is unbelievable. Wow. I mean, okay, let me sort of probe on who is this affecting and what is the effect on the victim and the community?
Very good questions, because the effects are very much on the individual and on the community and society at large. And let me say a little bit about that. For the older person, I mean, some of the things are obvious. If they're a victim of financial abuse, they're going to lose their resources, perhaps everything they own. But even if it's not everything they own, if they have limited incomes and things are tough for them, you know, rip off a couple $1,000s and you've really affected this person's life dramatically. So they're affected financially. Physically, of course, there's not only the harm that comes from the hurt of doing something physically, but that leads to other complications. You know, push somebody down, they break a hip. They break a hip, they're very likely to end up hospitalized, then in long-term care, and then maybe they don't recover from that. The other way that it really affects victims, besides the emotional toll on them, the sense of shame that they feel, particularly if they're being abused by somebody that they know, which is the majority of abuse cases are done by somebody we know. The majority of abusers are family members, or somebody who's related to you, or in some trusting positions. It's not the stranger that you don't know, although there's plenty of that as well. Older people who are abused die faster. They have higher mortality rates. They have higher morbidity rates, meaning that the complications that arise from the abuse are worse. So their health is affected. And then that, of course, affects us, all of us, from a society standpoint, in that very often older individuals who are abused need more hospitalization, they need more health care services.
Downward spiral.
Spiral. They use up more Medicaid dollars if they're on Medicaid. They use more Medicare dollars if they're on Medicare. So the costs associated with it are equally staggering. So that's traumatic. For an older person who is financially exploited or abused, banks suffer and financial institutions because they lose the money that they've had in that person's name. Very rarely is that ever regained somehow through restitution or through some other means. We know that from one study that was done, a very small scale study in one state, but we think it's really illustrative. They looked at case files of cases that had actually gone through Adult Protective Services. So it wasn't every case, but it was a selected group where they went through APS, or Adult Protective Services, and almost 10% of those that were victims of financial abuse, as a consequence, had to go on the Medicaid program, which meant, one, that they had been impoverished, and two, now their care is being paid for by the taxpayer at the federal and state level. So the ripple effects, and they're really not even ripples, they're waves of the effects of consequences of committing abuse or harming somebody this way they're profound. And thus, they reach into the millions and then billions of dollars. Just in financial exploitation alone, just that category of abuse. The most recent data suggests a range, and it's a big range, I know that, of between $3 billion and $36 billion a year lost.
Wow.
A year lost to financial abuse. And the first study that said $3 billion was a very, very narrow, limited study. The latter study, the most recent study, puts that figure at almost 10 times that.
Wow. Just briefly before we go to break, I'm probably like many people, had two wonderful grandmothers. One of my grandmothers sort of developed dementia. And the thing about it is, we didn't know when a ring or a piece of jewelry was missing whether she was falsely accusing someone or that person actually stole something. And I know I'm not alone, because families everywhere must be asking themselves the same question. If something disappeared, did she misplace it?
Of course.
Did that person, you know, perhaps someone was working with her for years and would never do that, or perhaps somebody did come in, you know, when she went into like you know, an institution or some sort of place. I mean, who knows, you know, what really happened? And it must be frustrating. It was frustrating with my family, because how would we find the item that was worth something, and how would she be calmed? How do you do this? Is really impossible to deal with.
Really
when you
complex.
don't know the truth.
That's right, really complex to deal with it. And it requires the ability and the resources, therefore, for people like adult protective services workers or law enforcement or other community resources to be able to really get to know what happened is labor intensive.
Yeah.
It's costly and it's time consuming and it's difficult and it's complex.
And I think that the trail would go dead at some point. That, you know, there'd be like no way to find out. I mean, how do you actually prove? I just don't see how the answer could be positively found, because it may never come up.
And sadly, it is found in a lot of cases, which is good news.
Okay, that is good news.
That is good news. We had an amazing situation, or you did, right here in Montgomery County, that was part of the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day activities here in Montgomery County a couple of weeks ago. 90-some-year-old Rhoda Baruch, who's a resident here, had a caregiver who had cared for her ailing husband until he died, and then she began to care for her because she was very frail in her early 90s, and at some point became aware that she was having money taken out of her bank account, substantial amounts of money, and got to the police. We had the ability to contact a police officer from Montgomery County. He did the research, he looked into it, and lo and behold, they found ATM camera footage of that caregiver who had been by her side and working with her for several years, was taking out of the ATM machine the maximum $500 you can take per day out of ATM.
Wow.
Well, get this, how many, she'd done it 99 times.
Wow.
$49,500.
Unbelievable.
And Mrs. Baruch spoke at a press conference with the county police chief and the state's attorney, and she looked right into the camera and she said, "I'm ashamed, I'm embarrassed to be here, but I need to be here," which was really incredibly courageous. But what was really amazing, she said, "I just refused to believe it was this trusted caregiver. I refused it until they showed me the photographs. Then I had to believe it." Very powerful. Now, just one case happened to be right here.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that on the show, because so many people that happens to it, who'd have thought?
Right.
Thank you for mentioning that. We will see you in a couple of minutes, and we will be right back, so don't go anywhere.
When you donate goods in response to an international disaster, it's expensive.
They have to cross the sea, pass through customs, be inspected, sorted, then finally delivered.
And often they arrive too late to help, making your good intentions feel a little empty.
There is a better way.
Cash donations are fast, simple, and allow professional relief workers to purchase supplies close at hand.
Cash is best. Learn more at CIDI.org.
It's our duty to serve veterans and military families who serve their country in the most difficult ways imaginable. Together, we can say thank you in so many ways. Small acts of kindness mean more than anything. With our support, veterans and military families can face even the most difficult challenges. Let's honor their service with ours.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back, and we are back with Bill Benson, an expert on on elder abuse and vulnerability and all those things we were talking about earlier, and he has really important information, so I want to get right to it.
Okay. There's some really important and startling and even very sad research results that we're beginning to learn about with respect to financial exploitation. So, for example, Dr. Dan Marston in his laboratory at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, is showing conclusively that older individuals who make bad financial decisions or just mismanage their money, don't handle their checkbook properly when they've had a history of doing it right, but for all other purposes, they're perfectly intact in the eyes of their family. In fact, that may be the early indicator of Alzheimer's disease. Almost like the way he puts it, almost like the canary in the mine, when people become, make poor financial decisions and thus are really vulnerable to financial exploitation. That's a very important research.
So it's a big deficit. Something to watch out for when people are heading down that way.
The good
sadly.
news is we're finally getting some research done in this country about elder abuse. We are learning more. We lag way behind from a research standpoint what we know about child abuse and domestic violence and other forms of abuse and violence. So we're finally beginning to understand the problem in the way that we need to understand it so that we can design ways to respond to it.
I'm glad you mentioned this because it's really crucial. And research needs to be ongoing, of course. How is Montgomery County a model, do you think? And I'm aware that you do think so. How is it a model
I
for
think
the rest
it's a
of us?
model in several ways. First, it's clear there's a commitment here from different key actors. You have a very fine adult protective services program. You have a long-term care ombudsman program. You have a state's attorney's office that has committed itself to dealing with elder abuse. You have the police department that's doing that. So each of them are really committed to this problem and made it clear it's a priority in creating special units, for example. But more significantly is they're working together. This is a problem, as we have already discussed, it's complex, it's multifaceted, it's a very difficult problem, and one particular actor can't deal with it alone. It requires multidisciplinary teams made up of all these different parties, prosecutors, law enforcement, adult protective services, social services. You've got all the right ingredients here in Montgomery County, like you do in many communities, only here they're actually doing it and coming together and approaching it together. So I think Montgomery County is doing it right, and particularly in the absence of very much federal support. So I think
That's the next question I had. The federal response is not so great, right?
It's not so great. There's been a lot of talk for many, many years. There's a 3-decade-long history in Congress about addressing this. Finally, in 2010, Congress passed the Elder Justice Act, which is the first really significant legislation to address elder abuse in this country. And a piece of it, for example, is to provide funding to states and local communities to support their adult protective services. At this moment, not one penny of federal money supports adult protective services in the field that's dedicated to that purpose. That's not true for child protective services. It's not true for domestic violence. So the Elder Justice Act passed in 2010, which had a lot of promise. To date, only $4 million has been appropriated under that law since 2010, and none of that is going out to states to support their adult protective services systems because it's such a small amount of money.
What is it going for then?
It's going to at least create an office at the national level to begin trying to help states do a better job, but it's not enough. We hoped for $100 million.
Wow.
Then you could give it to states.
Right.
But unfortunately, that hasn't happened. And that $4 million only came about this last year. So in 2011, 12, 13, not a penny was appropriated. So we have a long way to go to provide states and communities with the support they need. Now, having said that, there are some really good things that have happened at the federal level. At the Federal Administration for Community Living, where the Administration on Aging is located, they have just created the first ever National Office of Adult Protective Services. That's a big deal.
That's a start.
It's
right.
a start.
Yeah,
It's a start. We're
that's good.
excited about it. They've created what's called the Elder Justice Coordinating Council, where every federal agency that has some stake in this topic, and it's really a lot of agencies, come together to at least say, gosh, I didn't know you were involved in elder abuse. So that's the National Institute of Health, the Centers for Disease Control
Yeah.
and Prevention, HHS, the Administration for Community Living, but it's also the Federal Trade Commission, it's the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, it's the Postal Authority's Inspections Unit, it's the FBI, Department of Justice. All these players at least are now, for the first time ever, talking to each other and beginning to set priorities that they can approach together, kind of almost a multidisciplinary team approach. Those are good things, but they're baby steps. We have so much more that needs to be done if we're going to provide support to state and local communities to do more of what Montgomery County is doing.
Well, at least it's a baby step, which is something, right? Bill, how did you get involved in all this stuff?
I've been involved in this since the beginning of my career. I was a state long-term care ombudsman. I know you had Eileen Bennett on here. I created the program in California, got it started, and one thing led to another. I dealt with a lot of abuse cases in long-term care facilities, and eventually moved to Washington and began working on national policy related to elder abuse, and that's what I've done for almost my entire career.
Into the elderly and gerontology and that type of thing?
Pretty much from the get-go. I walked out of college and found a job at a senior center, and here I am all these years later.
That is interesting.
Yes, it surprised me, and but it's been wonderful. It's been really wonderful career.
Wow.
Yeah.
What can our viewers do to get involved, like today?
I think what they can do, for starters, is to be vigilant. Just as you said at the beginning, it's very hard to detect some forms of elder abuse, if not all forms of elder abuse. So you have to be vigilant. You have to, in your own family, your aunts, uncles, if you suspect something has gone wrong, look into it. Try to talk to the person. Most victims, one of the reasons why recent research shows that 1 out of 23 cases of elder abuse are brought to the attention of authorities. 1 out of 23.
Ridiculous.
And in financial abuse, it's estimated at 1 out of 44. And why? A lot of it's
So
behind
crazy.
closed doors. And the older victims, just like Montgomery County's Rhoda Baruch, they're embarrassed, they're fearful,
They're ashamed,
and
yeah.
ashamed. So they're not going to say, oh, by the way, I just got slapped around by my grandson. You have to really, it takes outside people, neighbors, friends, family, to be vigilant. Secondly, to know there are places you can turn. If you suspect elder abuse, you can go to law enforcement, you can go to the police, you can go to Adult Protective Services, you can go to the County Department of Health and Human Services. There are places to go, and that's something that people can do. And I think finally, I think personally what we can do is begin to say and accept this is a real problem. And until thousands and then millions of Americans say, oh my God, that's serious, I have to take that seriously, we have to do something about it. It's only then will we see the kinds of major responses that we need to elder abuse, just as we've done in the child abuse world. This is what I think is really fascinating, is the investments we've made in child abuse and domestic violence, they pay off. Get this, most people don't know this, but the actual rates of child abuse and domestic violence are dropping. They're dropping because we've made a serious effort to do something about it. Elder abuse cases are not dropping, they're going up, and we've made no serious investment in it. Money talks, and if we put money into this problem, and it's something that this problem needs, then we might be able to begin to stem this tide as we move into this demographic shift in which those 5 million cases are going to become 10 million cases, just because of demographics. So it requires everybody to say, no more. I'm not going to tolerate this. I'm going to vote for people who care about this issue. I'm going to demand it of local officials. I'm going to demand it of my senators and my members of Congress and members of the State House. This cries out for a real groundswell from the American people.
So people have to, first of all, be aware, and second of all, stand up and be counted.
Right.
Thanks, Bill. I'm going to give out some numbers and some ways to be in touch right now. The first thing, of course, is if someone's in danger, if you see someone in danger, call 911. That's the first thing to do. Now, if you want to contact Adult Protective Services, which Bill mentioned, 24 hours a day, you can call 240-777-3000. And for the police non-emergency number, you can call 301-279-8000. If you're not sure which number to call, dial 311. That's county information. That's pretty simple. Dial 311. Okay, the other thing is, you can visit the Connecting Our Community blog on the mymcmedia.org website. That's mymcmedia.org. I think I got everything down. Any other numbers we should mention?
I think you
That's
covered
pretty
them.
much it. So first let me thank Bill Benson, because I'm just trying to go back to his title right now because there's so many things that Bill does. The National Policy Advisor, National Adult Protective Services Association, a founding member of the Elder Justice Coalition, and a darn good speechifier, as he did at the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day event. Wow, okay. Thank you so much. You
Thank you,
enlightened
Karen.
me, and hopefully everybody out there, and people will hopefully get started and speak up about elder abuse. I'm Karen Allen, everybody. Thank you for watching this edition of Connecting Our Community. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.